Gwyn and welcome back to the Revolver Beetle channel. Let's talk about this. George Harrison's 1974 album, Dark Horse. When people criticise Dark Horse, they usually focus on one thing, and that's George's voice. And yes, it is rough, sometimes painfully so. But what often gets ignored is why this album sounds the way it does. What was actually going on in George's life when he made it? With the possible exception of John's Plastic Ono Band album, this reflects the bare, raw, honest turmoil of the artist more than all the others in the solo canon. This album isn't just an album recorded during a tour, it's an album recorded during a personal collapse. A collapsing marriage, a very public love triangle, or even two, spiritual exhaustion, physical illness, loads of manoeuvring through the various Beatles litigation that was going on at the time, and setting up his own record label, Dark Horse Records. He was also recording other artists too, including Splinter, and the pressure of being a former Beatle who refused to live like one. So today, we're going to do a deep, full dive into Dark Horse. We're going to look at every track on Dark Horse and George's complicated personal life too, and why this album feels less like a statement and more like a confession. By 1974, George Harrison's life was crowded with contradictions. He was deeply spiritual, but emotionally restless. He preached detachment, but was deeply entangled. He valued privacy, but was constantly scrutinised. His marriage to Pattie Boyd, once the great love story of the Beatles era, was unravelling fast. George was openly involved with Maureen Starkey, Ringo's wife, a situation that fractured friendships and devastated Pattie. George later admitted he behaved badly during this period. George, Eric Clapton and Ronnie Wood and their respective partners and girlfriends wove a very intricate web of infidelity that runs Fleetwood Mac's Rumours sessions close for relationship complexity. And Dark Horse is one of the few places where you can actually hear that turmoil. This album doesn't excuse anything, but it does document it honestly. So let's look at the album's title, Dark Horse. Calling it Dark Horse wasn't accidental. A dark horse is someone underestimated, misunderstood, or operating quietly outside expectations. George saw himself this way, overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney, criticised for his spirituality, misread as passive or even dull. This album is George saying, I'm still here, even if you don't like how I sound right now. One last bit of context that really matters with Dark Horse is where and how it was recorded, because this wasn't a relaxed, locked-away studio project. Most of the album was recorded in 1974, primarily at A&M Studios in Los Angeles, with additional work done at George's own Friar Park Studios in Henley, England. And that split alone tells you quite a bit. A&M was a professional, fast-moving environment, musicians coming and going, sessions booked tightly, very little time to stop and rethink things. George was recording there while also rehearsing for the 1974 North American tour, often on the same day. With George being afflicted with poor health, there wasn't the attitude of, let's wait until I'm better. This was, we've got to get this finished. Friar Park, on the other hand, was George's spiritual home. Quieter, more reflective, more private, more comfortable. But even there, the sessions weren't calm. He was still dealing with his illness, emotional turmoil, and looming deadlines. So instead of one cohesive, carefully planned recording period, Dark Horse was stitched together across locations, moods, and moments of exhaustion for George. And honestly, you can hear it in the songs. The album feels like it's constantly in motion, because it was. This wasn't George Harrison retreating to make a perfect album. This was George Harrison trying to keep moving while everything around him was falling apart. So let's get to the nitty-gritty. Let's have a look at the tracks. Track 1, Harry's on Tour, brackets Express. Leading an album off with an instrumental seems like a strange choice, but how much more effort would it have been for George to have written some lyrics for it? Singing them may have been a problem at the time though. The tune itself is pacey, driving and musically efficient, with some very nice guitar lines by George and complimentary horns courtesy of Tom Scott of LA Express. It's kind of like George saying, I'm on the move, I'm overwhelmed, and I don't have time to clear this up. It encapsulates his messy lifestyle in some ways, touring, rehearsing, recording, running a label, and falling apart emotionally. Track 2 is Simply Shady. Now things get very personal here. Simply Shady is one of the most bitter songs George has ever written, and that bitterness feels earned. The song is widely interpreted as being about betrayal and disillusionment, and it's almost impossible not to connect it to the collapse of his marriage to Patty and the fallout from his affair. There's a definite sense here of George both accusing others and recognising his own moral confusion, spiritually searching but emotionally compromised. Track 3 is So Sad. This one is heartbreaking in its simplicity. So Sad feels like George quietly acknowledging that something beautiful is coming to an end and that no amount of philosophy can stop it. It's widely understood to be about Patty. There's no anger here, just resignation. The track does feature dual drummers in Ringo and Jim Keltner and the great Nicky Hopkins complementing George on guitar with some fantastic piano work, and there's also Willie Weeks on bass. This is George accepting that love doesn't always survive spiritual growth, especially when an ego gets involved. Track 4 is Bye Bye Love. Yes, that song, a cover of the Everly Brothers classic, might seem like an odd choice, but it seems to work emotionally. But why? Well, because George doesn't sing it nostalgically, he sings it like a farewell he's not really fully ready to say. It plays like a private goodbye, disguised as a familiarish tune as George veers away from the original arrangement and lyrics, referring both to Patty and Eric Clapton. To close out side 1, Maya Love. This is one of the most fascinating tracks on the album. Maya, in Hindu philosophy, refers to illusion, the idea that the material world tricks us into attachment and suffering. This song is George trying to understand his own contradictions. Spiritual clarity versus emotional desire. Detachment versus obsession. The irony is painful. George knows the theory but can't live it yet. Billy Preston guests on this track, and Tom Scott of LA Express again contributing great horns to the track. Side 2 kicks off with Ding Dong Ding Dong. This song often gets dismissed as lightweight, but context matters here. George wrote this as a New Year's message, encouraging renewal and forward motion. And after everything that's on side 1, it feels like George is desperately wanting a reset, even if he hasn't earned it yet. It's a kind of optimism by force of will. It's very difficult to get out of your head too, very much an earworm. George assembles some of his mates, including Gary Wright, Klaus Voormann and Alvin Lee, to supplement the big sound of the track, kind of a la Spectre. Next up is Dark Horse, the title track, and The Lightning Rod. Lyrically, this is George pushing back against the critics, doubters and people who underestimated him. But the tragedy is that his voice, ravaged by laryngitis, undermines the song's message. Still, the groove is a really strong one. The lyrics are defiant. This is kind of like George saying, I've been written off before, don't try it again. Track 8 is Far East Man, one of the album's true highlights, and was co-written with Ronnie Wood. This song is warm, soulful and reflective. It's about friendship, loyalty and shared survival. And many hear it as George's acknowledgement of the people who stood by him when things got messy. After the emotional heaviness earlier in the LP, this song feels like a hand on the shoulder, very reassuring, a beautiful groove and superbly executed by George's band. And finally, track 9, it is he, Jai Shri Krishna. This could be the spiritual core of Dark Horse. By this point, George retreats completely from personal drama and turns inward. The song isn't performative, it feels meditative, almost private. The chant at the end isn't there to convince anybody, it's there because George needed grounding. This is George remembering who he is beneath the chaos. So those are the tracks, but let's throw a bit more context into the mix. And we can't dance around this. George's affair with Maureen Starkey shattered relationships, including his friendship with Ringo, at least temporarily. Patty was devastated. She wrote later openly about how lonely and neglected she felt during this time. George, for all his spiritual insight, behaved pretty selfishly. And Dark Horse doesn't excuse that, but it reflects the confusion of a man who hadn't reconciled enlightenment with emotional responsibility. Over the coming years, George would find greater balance with Olivia, who brought stability, some humour and grounding into his life. But in 1974, George was lost. This album sounds rough because George was rough. He was physically ill, emotionally compromised, spiritually searching, and instead of hiding it, he documented it. That's brave, even if it's uncomfortable to listen to. So who was helping George to make this album? Because it wasn't a random pickup band, and it wasn't a group of anonymous session players either. Dark Horse was recorded with a loose, shifting collective of musicians, many of whom George would later take on the road with him in 1974. And that matters because this album sounds like a band learning to breathe together in real time. So let's inspect the players. First off, George, obviously, on guitar, vocals and producer. Obviously, everything starts with George. By this point, George wasn't just the artist, he was the producer, the label head, the band leader and the emotional centre of the project. Musically, George leans heavily into his slide guitar playing, but it's looser and more conversational than on All Things Must Pass. He's not trying to dominate the songs, he's responding to them. Vocally, well, we know the story. His voice was severely damaged and he recorded anyway. But what often gets missed is how committed those performances are. There's no hiding behind effects or backing vocalists. George is exposed here, and deliberately. George was fundamentally supported by Billy Preston on keyboards and electric piano. If there's one musician who acts as a lifeline on Dark Horse, it's Billy Preston. Billy had been close to George since the Beatle days and brought a warmth, soul and stability into the sessions that could easily have fallen apart. His electric piano work adds groove and emotional cushioning, also a sense of humanity. Whenever Dark Horse threatens to feel too cold or brittle, Billy's playing pulls it back towards warmth. There's a reason George trusted him so deeply. Sharing some of the guitar duties is Alvin Lee. Yes, that Alvin Lee from 10 Years After. His presence gives Dark Horse a slightly edgier, more blues rock feel than George's earlier solo works. But Lee isn't flashy. Instead, he adds urgency and muscle and a rougher edge that fits the album's emotional state. This isn't pristine studio rock, it's road-ready music. Ron Wood appears on guitar and as a co-writer, and his influence is most obvious on Far East Man, which he co-wrote with George. Their chemistry is immediately obvious. Ron brings a relaxed, rootsy feel that contrasts beautifully with George's spiritual intensity. The result is one of the album's most balanced, human moments. It's also a glimpse of George connecting with musicians who weren't burdened by the Beatles mythology, just musicians playing together. Willie Weeks is on bass, and this one's important because Willie Weeks is a phenomenal bassist and his playing on Dark Horse is quietly brilliant. He doesn't overplay, he listens, he supports, and his bass lines provide a solid emotional floor, a sense of calm underneath the whole of the chaos, and he provides groove without showmanship. In many ways, Willie Weeks holds this album together more than anyone really realises. We also have Jim Keltner on drums. If there's one drummer who defines the post-Beatles solo era, it's Jim Keltner. Keltner doesn't bash, he breathes, and on Dark Horse his drumming is subtle, responsive and emotionally intelligent. Jim follows George's mood rather than forcing the songs into shape, and that flexibility is crucial on an album that was constantly shifting during the recording process. And yes, we also have Ringo Starr on drums. Yep, Ringo does appear on Dark Horse, which is kind of remarkable considering the personal turmoil happening at this time. That alone tells you about the depth of the relationships involved. As always, Ringo's drumming is instantly recognisable, relaxed, musical and unshowy. His presence adds a familiar warmth, even if it's brief, and symbolically it suggests that despite everything, the bonds between the Beatles weren't completely broken. Other musicians contributing to Dark Horse include Tom Scott on saxophone and woodwinds and Chuck Finley on trumpet. And they add a texture rather than flashiness. Their contributions help give Dark Horse that slightly jazzy, late-night, lived-in atmosphere. It's not a pristine studio album, it's a working musician's record. So all in all, I guess you could say the album sounds the way it does because it's recorded by friends, trusted collaborators, touring musicians, and people George felt safe being just in their presence. There's very little studio trickery on this album either. What you hear is what is happening. And once you understand that, Dark Horse stops sounding like a failure and starts sounding like a document. Unlike All Things Must Pass, which feels monumental and carefully constructed, Dark Horse feels collective. It's musicians reacting to George in real time, adjusting, supporting, and sometimes compensating for his inadequacies. And that human element is what gives the album a strange kind of power. These players didn't just contribute notes, they carried songs when George couldn't. They adapted to last-minute changes and helped shape an album recorded under near impossible conditions. Without them, Dark Horse simply wouldn't exist. Removed from the expectations of 1974, Dark Horse feels less like a failure and more like a diary. It's not polished, it's not proud, but honest, and that honesty gives it value. So where does Dark Horse fit in George's journey? Well, it isn't a destination, it's kind of a crossroads for George, and without it, George couldn't have moved forward to the clarity and confidence of some of his later work. Sometimes the most important albums aren't the best ones, they're the necessary ones. So next time you listen to this album, don't listen for perfection, listen for truth. Because this album isn't about sounding good, it's about surviving a moment when everything felt like it was falling apart. Because George Harrison never pretended to have figured it all out. And Dark Horse might be the album where he admits that most clearly of all. In summary, this isn't George's best work. His vocals are a distraction at times, but the musicianship is expertly delivered and shows the direction he will take on his following albums. If pushed for a score, I would score this 3 out of 5. If you've enjoyed this deep dive, please give the video a like, subscribe for more Beatles and solo Beatles history, and let me know in the comments, has Dark Horse changed for you over time? Dark Horse could be the next in sequence for the box set treatment, but does it deserve it? And would you want it? Think about that and let me know in the comments below. And I look forward to seeing you next time. But until then, bye for now.